Chapter 1. The Call to Hunt. Marienburg, the great port of the Old World. The air stank of salt, rotting fish, and desperation. Marienburg's docks had always been a place where the unwanted and the ambitious mingled, where merchants haggled over exotic goods, where thieves and cutthroats prowled the alleyways, and where the sea itself seemed to whisper secrets to those mad enough to listen. Captain Aldric Faust sat in the back corner of the Black Gull, a tavern where the walls were stained with rum, blood, and regret. It was a place where no man asked too many questions, where debts were paid in silence, and treachery was simply part of the decor. The candlelight flickered as the doors swung open, letting in the damp chill of the night. A man stepped inside. Not just any man. The room fell to an unnatural hush as Matthias von Richten entered, his heavy black coat trailing behind him like a shadow with weight. His presence was suffocating. He wore no sigils, but the way his sharp steel-gall eyes cut through the room was enough to mark him for what he was, an Imperial Inquisitor. Aldric had seen his kind before. He had no love for them. They were men who walked between righteousness and madness, treating both with the same cold indifference. Von Richten sat across from Aldric without asking permission, pulling back his hood to reveal a gaunt, weathered face. Scarred, hardened, unyielding. He did not waste words. "You're Faust?" It was not a question. Aldrich took a slow sip of his rum before replying, his voice as rough as the tides. "Aye, that depends on who's asking." Von Richten did not blink. "I need a ship, a captain, a crew who will sail into hell itself and not flinch." Aldric leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "Hell doesn't pay well." The Inquisitor reached into his coat and produced something small and metallic. He placed it on the table with deliberate care. A coin. Not gold, not silver, but a dull, blackened thing, its surface shifting, as if the metal was uncertain what shape it wanted to be. Aldric had been at sea long enough to recognize taint when he saw it. His fingers twitched toward his pistol. "What in the dark God's name is that?" Von Richten lowered his voice. "A warning." He slid the object back into his coat, his gaze never wavering. "Have you heard the tales? Of ships found adrift, crews twisted, fused into their own decks like wax melted into wood?" Aldric frowned. He had heard the rumors, sailors whispering in dockside taverns, merchantmen swearing that entire convoys were vanishing, their wrecks turning up weeks later, filled with things that should not be. Chaos. Aldric said the word as though it left a stain on his tongue. Von Richten shook his head. "Not merely chaos. Something worse." Aldric smirked. "And you think my crew can kill it? I think you're the only ones mad enough to try." The crew of the Stormborn. By dawn, Aldric stood on the docks, staring at his ship. The Stormborn was no pretty Imperial warship with golden laurels and proud banners. No, she was a beast of the sea, her hull blackened with pitch, her cannons marked by 100 battles. She had carried Aldric through storms, pirate ambushes, and the fire of Drakeshot, and now she would carry him into madness. Aldric's eyes swept over his crew, hardened men and women, bound together by desperation and greed. Some had served with him for years, others were killers, fugitives, and worse, men who could slit a throat with the same ease they peeled an orange. Then there was the navigator. She stood apart from the others, a tall, cloaked figure with pale scars cutting across her hands, and the 1,000-yard stare of one who had seen what lies beyond the veil of sanity. Yelena Volkova, a Kislevite, a navigator who claimed to see things in the winds that others could not. Aldric had never trusted magic, but he trusted survival, and Yelena had survived things that would have broken lesser men. She caught his gaze and smirked. "Captain," her voice carried the icy chill of the north, "do you fear ghosts?" Aldrich snorted. "I fear unpaid debts more. The voyage begins." As the Stormborn pulled away from the docks, Aldric felt the weight of something pressing upon his shoulders. The hunt. He had chased men before. He had hunted pirates, traitors, and monsters that bled and died as any beast of flesh should. But this time was different. As Marienburg shrank into the horizon, Aldric turned his gaze to the unnatural darkness gathering in the western seas. A storm was coming, and in its heart something watched them back. Chapter 2. Whispers on the Waves. The sea knows. The first whisper came with the fog. A thick, unnatural mist rolled over the Stormborn as it cut through the cold waters of the Sea of Claws. The ship's lanterns struggled against the gloom, their glow swallowed by the shifting haze. The crew muttered to themselves, their voices hushed as if the very air was listening. Aldric Faust stood at the helm, his hands gripping the worn wood of the wheel. He had sailed in storms that cracked the sky with fury. He had crossed waters where the dead floated in endless silence. But this was something else. The men whispered of a horror that took the shape of what it devoured. They spoke of ships that never returned, of sailors who died screaming, their bodies twisting into something that still moved after death. "The beast ain't natural, Captain." Eldritch turned his gaze to the speaker, Jorik One Hand, a grizzled deckhand who had served under him for 5 years. The man had survived a run-in with Norscan reavers, losing his hand but keeping his life. It took a special kind of horror to rattle someone like him. "You sound like a damn fool," Aldric said, but the words rang hollow, even in his own ears. Jorik swallowed hard. "Then what's that?" He pointed to the sea. Aldric followed his gaze, and his blood went cold. Something was floating in the water, half shrouded in mist. A ship's corpse, broken and bleeding. The wreck of the Falcon's Bane. The wreck drifted toward them, a half-sunken Nordland merchant vessel that had no right to still be afloat. Her sails were torn, her mast cracked, but it was the hull that made Aldric's stomach turn. The wood was alive. At first he thought it was merely rot, dark patches creeping across the planks, but as the Stormborn drew closer, he saw the truth. Faces. Twisted, screaming faces stretched across the wood like wax melted into flesh. Hands fused into rigging. Eyes blinking from knots in the timber. Mouths gasping silently. The ship itself had become a tomb of suffering. Aldrich clenched his jaw. He had seen chaos corruption before, but this was no plague, no mutation of flesh alone. This was something far worse. "Lower the skiff," he ordered. No one moved. "I said lower the damned skiff." It took 3 tries before the crew obeyed, rowing hesitantly toward the floating nightmare. Aldric went himself, not out of bravery, but because he would not demand his men do something he would not. They boarded the wreck with caution, boots creaking against damp wood that moaned beneath their weight. The air stank of brine, death, and something unnatural, something that made the skin itch and the mind recoil. Bodies littered the deck, what remained of them. Some had melted into the planks, others had too many limbs, too many eyes. And yet one still lived. The scholar's final words. He was barely human anymore. Hunched in the shattered remains of the captain's cabin, he shivered and twitched, his body caught in the grip of some unseen force. His skin crawled with shifting sigils, glowing and fading, as though his very essence was unraveling. Aldric knelt beside him. "Who are you?" The man turned his head, and Aldric saw what was left of his face. His eyes were mismatched, one an endless abyss, the other a writhing mass of tentacles. His lips cracked as he tried to speak, but his voice came in 2 tones at once, one his own, the other something else. The tides shift. The architect watches. Aldric's fingers tightened on the hilt of his cutlass. "What did this?" The man wheezed a wet, gurgling sound, half laugh, half sob. "It was never a beast. It was never just a beast." His hands clawed at Aldric's coat, his strength inhuman despite his frail form. His breath came in shudders, each exhale a rasp of something dying and becoming. "Tzeentch's tide comes, Captain. There is no anchor that holds, no fate that is set, only the game." And with that his body unraveled, not like a man dying, but like a dream dissolving upon waking. His form collapsed into ash and ink, vanishing into the wind. Aldrich stared at the empty space where the scholar had been, his mind racing. No anchor that holds, no fate that is set, only the game. The whispering wind laughed. Chapter 3. The First Encounter. The darkest hour. The wind died with a whisper. The storm-born cut through the waves beneath a moonless sky, the sea a yawning abyss of ink and silence. No gulls, no wind, no sound but the uneasy creak of the hull. It was a stillness that set teeth on edge, a silence that did not belong. Aldric Faust stood at the prow, staring into the black horizon. The weight of the scholar's final words sat heavy in his gut. No fate is set, no anchor that holds, only the game. Behind him, the crew worked in hushed voices, speaking as if afraid to wake something that might be listening. And then, a ripple in the dark. A shadow too large to be a wave moved beneath the water, a vast and impossible shape, shifting and twisting just beneath the surface. Yelena Volkova, the navigator, was the first to see it. She did not shout, she did not scream, she simply exhaled a curse in Kislevite and grabbed Aldric's arm with fingers like cold iron. "It is here." The words had barely left her lips before the sea exploded. The chaos beast unleashed. It rose from the abyss in a storm of churning black water, a shape too vast to be real, too fluid to be bound by mere flesh. A great winged serpent, its body coiled in impossible patterns, shifting in ways the eye could not follow. Its scales shimmered like liquid midnight, reflecting faces, some human, some not. Its wings were not wings, but things that suggested wings, shifting between feathers, fins, and something that was neither. And then it screamed. A sound that was not sound, but a cacophony of stolen voices, a dozen tongues, 100 throats, each wailing in agony. The crew froze. Then Aldrich drew his sword. Ardent. A battle against madness. The beast struck first. It did not pounce or lunge, it folded the space between them, one moment a shadow on the waves, the next looming above the deck. A rower named Carl barely had time to scream before its mouth engulfed him, but it did not chew, did not swallow. It absorbed him. And then Carl was standing on the deck, or rather, something wearing Carl's face. His eyes were wrong, too black, too deep, as if his soul had been scooped out and replaced with something else. He turned, grinning too wide, and spoke in his own voice. "Captain." Then he drew his own dagger and plunged it into his throat. The crew erupted into chaos. The beast was not merely killing, it was taking. Each time it struck, another face appeared within its shifting mass. Another voice added to the growing chorus. A deckhand named Eric lunged with his cutlass, slashing across its coiling, shifting flesh, but before he could strike again, a perfect copy of him stepped from the beast's shadow, grinning with his own face. "I was you," it whispered. "Now you are me." A heartbeat later, Eric's doppelganger sank its teeth into his throat, and the real Eric was gone. The harpooner's last stand. Only one man did not hesitate. Oscar Varn, the harpooner, was a giant of a man, a Nordland whaler with arms like tree trunks and a stare like a storm-whacked sea. He had killed krakens, sea drakes, and worse. And he had no fear left to give. He grabbed his harpoon, whispered a prayer to Manan, and hurled it with all the force of a cannon blast. The iron tip buried itself deep into the chaos beast's shifting flesh. For the first time, it recoiled. It let out a sound like glass shattering backward, its mass rippling in agony. The stolen faces twisted, flickered, broke apart like reflections in a shattered mirror. Oscar roared. "You bleed, then you die." He grabbed the harpoon line, digging his boots into the deck, pulling with all his might. For a moment, just a moment, the beast seemed tangible, real, and then it smiled, not with a mouth, but with every stolen face. "No, Ostebard," it whispered in 1,000 voices. "You die." The line snapped. The harpoon vanished into the abyss, and Oscar was pulled with it. The last thing they saw of him was his hand reaching above the waves before it became something else, twisting, shifting, vanishing beneath the black sea. Aldric lunged forward, but it was too late. The water whispered, and it whispered with Oscar's voice. "I was you, now you are me." Then, silence. The beast was gone, but the faces in the water were still watching. Chapter 4. The Sorcerer's Warning. Port of the Damned. Certosa, the city of pirates, exiles, and the damned. A place where gold outweighed loyalty, and where a man's life was worth exactly the price of his own blood. The Stormborn cut through the jade waters of its bay, sails torn, hull scarred from the nightmare at sea. Aldric Faust stood at the helm, his hands tight on the wheel. His mind still reeled from what they had seen, the chaos beast, the way it had stolen his men, the way it had whispered in Oscar Varn's voice long after he had been swallowed by the abyss. He had fought many things in his time, mutants, witches, sea dragons, but never a nightmare made flesh. And so he had come here, to find a man who knew the language of the dead. Lucas Schwarzschild. The Stormborn docked in Sartosa beneath a sky of ashen gray, gulls screaming like the souls of the damned. Yelena Volkova walked beside Aldric, her fur-lined coat barely fending off the unnatural chill. "Isrithered," she murmured, watching the streets with wary eyes. "How much do you trust him?" Aldric scoffed. "I don't, but I trust gold, and Schwarzschild needs it. Or have it," he added, frowning. They found him in the bone quarter, where the air was thick with the scent of rotting incense and forgotten prayers. His tower, if it could be called that, was a leaning wreck of broken stone, its walls covered in dying runes that pulsed with something half alive, half decayed. Lucas Schwarzschild had once been an amethyst wizard of the colleges of magic, a master of death's whispers. Now he was a man one step beyond sanity, exiled from the Empire for delving into forbidden truths. Aldrich knocked once before the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the chamber smelled of damp parchment and old bones. Scrolls littered the tables. A dying candle cast jagged shadows on the walls, and in the center of it all, hunched over a yellowed map of the sea, was Lucas Schwarzschild, a man who had already seen his own death. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched too tight over his bones. His eyes, once human, were now pools of shifting darkness, reflecting something not entirely of this world. He did not look up. "You seek it, Captain Faust." His voice was cracked, worn, as if he had not spoken in years. "You seek what cannot be caught." Aldric folded his arms. "I've hunted things that bleed before." Schwarzel chuckled. It was not a pleasant sound. "Then you are chasing the wrong prey." The nature of the beast. Schwarzschild moved to a table covered in ancient tomes, his fingers tracing symbols older than the Empire itself. "You think it is a monster?" He tilted his head, eyes narrowing. A sea serpent? A daemon? Something that bleeds and dies? He slammed a hand down on a rotting scroll, the force making the candle sputter. It is none of these things. Aldric scowled. Then what is it? Schwarzschild turned to face him fully, his face barely human in the flickering light. A wound? Silence. The sorcerer continued, his voice barely above a whisper. It is not a creature, it is not a thing, it is an extension of his will. He gestured at the shadows, where the air itself seemed to ripple and twist. Tzeentch. The name alone sent a ripple through the room, as though the walls themselves flinched. Schwarzschild's hands trembled as he continued. It is not bound by time, not bound by shape. It is change incarnate. It does not kill. It becomes. Aldric's throat felt dry. Then how do I stop it? Schwarzschild laughed. This time it was almost pitying. You don't. The curse astrolabe. But then Tzeentch reached beneath his tattered robes, pulling something blackened with age from the shadows. It was a strange, cursed-looking thing, an astrolabe, but not of any make Aldric had ever seen. Its surface was etched with runes that flickered between comprehension and madness. The edges were burned as though it had been pulled from some abyssal fire. Schwarzschild set it down with reverence. This may help you see it, but to see it is to risk becoming part of it. Aldrich stared at the thing. Something about it ached, not in his flesh, but in his mind. Yelena shifted beside him, her gaze cautious. What is the price? Schwarzel exhaled, rubbing at his temples. You will not be the same. None who gaze too long into the architect's tide remain unchanged. He met Aldric's eyes. But if you wish to hunt the shifting horror, you must be willing to shift as well. Aldric reached out, hesitated, then gripped the blackened astrolabe. The moment he touched it, he saw something. A flash. A vision of himself, not as he was, but as he could be. 1,000 versions, 1,000 choices, each whispering in his ear. And then, darkness. He staggered back, heart hammering, the artifact clutched in his grip. Schwarzschild smiled. The hunt has truly begun, Captain Faust. Aldric closed his eyes, steadying himself. The feeling of 1,000 possible fates still crawled in his mind. He had set sail to kill a beast. Now he understood. It was never just a beast. It was a game. And the moment he had taken the astrolabe, he had entered it. Chapter 5. The Stormborn's Descent. Drifting toward madness. The Stormborn sailed into a sea without stars. For days, the sky remained a smothering black, the horizon blurred into an endless void. The wind had not stopped, it had simply changed, whispering in voices that no man wished to understand. The compass spun aimlessly. The maps failed them. And then the crew began to change. Aldric Faust had seen men break before. Fear could turn the bravest warrior into a cowering wretch, but this was different. This was not fear. This was infection. A sickness of the mind. It started with Yorick one hand. He awoke screaming, clutching his arms as if something burned beneath his skin. When the crew pried his hands away, they saw writing, not tattooed, not carved, but growing, as though his flesh had become a parchment for some unholy script. Black words slithered across his chest, shifting and rearranging even as they watched. No one could read them, not fully, but glimpses were enough. They spoke of change, of the tides of fate unraveling, of a name that was never the same twice. The moment Yelena tried to speak one of the words aloud, the ship lurched, as if the sea itself had heard. Aldric ordered Jorik thrown in chains, locked below deck, before his screams could spread to the others. But it was already too late. The madness was growing, and it was hungry. The ship without bearings. The stars were gone. The sun no longer rose where it should. The compass spun wildly, pointing towards something unseen. The sea changed color by the hour, sometimes black as ink, sometimes shimmering with colors that did not belong to this world. The men grew restless. The whispers came at night. They started softly. A muttering beneath the deck, a distant echo from the waves. But soon they became voices. Some of the crew recognized them. A wife, long dead. A father, lost at sea. A child that had never been born. And the voices knew things. They whispered secrets no man should know, dredging up the past like a corpse dragged from the deep. By the fourth night, a man threw himself overboard, diving into the Black Sea with a smile. By the fifth, a fight broke out. The keelhaulen. It was Rufus the Butcher who swung the first blade. A massive brute of a man, once a mercenary in Tilea, now a sailor with too many debts and too little soul left to sell. It started with an argument, something petty, something meaningless, a ration dispute maybe, or perhaps it had never been about the fight at all. Perhaps the sea had already decided who would die. The brawl turned bloody within moments. Rufus carved open a man's throat before the crew overpowered him, slamming him to the deck, kicking and cursing. Aldrich could see it in their eyes. This wasn't justice. It was fear, trying to disguise itself as order. Still, the law of the sea was the law. Keel hauling. They tied a rope to Rufus's bound hands, running it beneath the hull, one end at the bow, the other at the stern. A death sentence. Aldrich stood over him, staring down. "You regret it?" Rufus grinned. "Regret?" He leaned forward, whispering so only Aldrich could hear. "Captain, you think I'm the only one who's been touched. Watch them. The tide ain't just coming. It's already here." Aldrich said nothing. Then he gave the order. The crew heaved. The rope jerked. Rufus was yanked beneath the ship, dragged across the barnacle-crusted hull, his body scraping, tearing, breaking. 1 minute passed. 2, 3. The ropes surfaced. The crew pulled him back aboard, expecting nothing but a shredded corpse. But Rufus was still alive. Barely. His face was half gone, his skin torn away, his ribs exposed. He should have been dead. But his eyes were open, and his mouth moved. No air should have been left in his lungs, no words should have come from his throat. But he spoke, and it was not his voice. "You think this ship still sails for men? No, 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 the game has begun, the tides have chosen, the anchor is cut." The crew stumbled back. Some clutched their ears, others retched on the deck. Aldrich held his ground. He knelt beside what was left of Rufus, staring into those too wide, too empty eyes. "What are you?" Rufus, or what remained of him, smiled. "I am change, and so are you." Then, finally, he died, and the waves took his whispering voice with them. The descent continues. That night, no man slept. The Stormborn drifted on a sea that no longer obeyed reason. The sky churned with unseen shapes, the air felt heavy, pressing down like an unseen hand. And below deck, Yorick One Hand still muttered in his sleep, his skin still writhing with cursed words. Aldrich stood at the bow, gripping the blackened astrolabe. It no longer pointed north. It pointed toward something else. Something waiting, something watching. And deep in the water, beneath the creaking ship, a whisper echoed. "You were never the hunter, Captain. You were always the prey." Chapter 6. The Shadow Fleet. The graveyard on the water. The Stormborn drifted through a sea of corpse light. The waters had turned pale and sickly, shimmering not with moonlight, but with something else. A glow, that pulsed in unnatural rhythms, like the heartbeat of a dying god. The wind had stilled to a hush, yet whispers still reached their ears, carried on no breeze. Aldric Faust stood at the helm, his grip white-knuckled on the wheel. The blackened astrolabe trembled in his hands, its markings shifting like ink bleeding through parchment. It no longer pointed north, nor to any star known to man. It pointed forward, toward the mass of shadow that swallowed the horizon. And then they saw it. A fleet. At first it looked like nothing more than a dense fog bank, a wall of mist obscuring the distance. But then, as the waves pulled them closer, they saw the truth. Ship. Hundreds of them. But they were wrong. Masts twisted into unnatural spirals, hulls fused together, growing like tumors, wooden ribs merging into each other, forming a grotesque flotilla of flesh and timber. Cannons with screaming faces, decks slick with something not water, not blood. Some of the ships still bore the remnants of their banners, the proud wolf of Middenheim, the twin-tailed comet of Sigmar, the lion of Bretonnia. But they were dead symbols, mockeries of what they once stood for. This was no fleet of men. This was a graveyard that still breathed. Aldric took a step back, his throat dry. Gods preserve us. But the gods had already turned their backs, because the ships were moving, and they were coming for them. A dead fleet that still obeys. The first impact came like a scream from the abyss. A mast from a half-sunken Rakeland warship splintered and twisted, moving like a limb, reaching for the Stormborn as if the ship itself was trying to drag them in. The water beneath them boiled, and from it rose the crew of the dead fleet. Men, or what had once been men, crawled from the sea, their bodies fused with their ships, their faces stretched into masks of agony. Some had barnacles growing from their eye sockets, others had timbers splitting through their spines, veins of iron and rope pumping something black through their twisted forms. And they spoke. It was not one voice. It was 100 voices, 1,000 voices, speaking in perfect unison. And at the center of them, towering above the fleet, wrapped in mist and shadow, the Chaos Beast watched. Its body coiled through the fleet, shifting between forms, its face a shattered mirror of stolen visages. It had learned. It had not just devoured men. It had enslaved them. And now it would take the crew of the Stormborn as well? The escape that cost blood. Hard to starboard. Aldric's voice cut through the rising horror as the crew sprang into motion. The Stormborn lurched, its hull groaning in protest as the ship tilted violently, narrowly avoiding a writhing mass of rigging that lunged from the sea like grasping fingers. Von Richten stood at the stern, his pistol raised, his face grim. The Inquisitor's coat billowed behind him as he chanted in clipped, precise High Gothic, his words laced with the sharp authority of Sigmar's judgment. A burst of holy fire erupted from his outstretched hand, slamming into the nearest ship abomination. The thing screamed. Its sails caught fire, not with normal flame, but with something that burned from within, turning the crew into pillars of ash. But it was not enough. A harpoon of living wood burst from the water, striking von Richten in the side, spearing through his coat and into flesh. He grunted, staggering back. But he did not fall. Aldric saw the wound, saw the black veins already spreading, and his stomach turned. "Get him below deck," he roared. 2 men grabbed the wounded Inquisitor and dragged him away as the Stormborn sailed for its life. The wind picked up, a sudden, unnatural gust, and the ship surged forward. But not on its own. Yelena Volkova stood at the prow, her hands gripping the railing, her eyes rolled back in her skull. And she was speaking. No, not speaking, chanting. A language that was not meant for mortal tongues spilled from her lips, her voice layered and fractured, shifting between octaves. The air around her wavered, as if the world itself recoiled from her words. Aldric grabbed her shoulders. "Pielena, stop!" Her eyes snapped open, and for a brief moment they were not hers. They were the stars reflected in deep, endless waters. And she whispered, her voice distant, "The tide is turned." Then she collapsed, her body limp. But the Stormborn lurched forward, caught in a sudden gale that carried them from the Nightmare fleet, propelling them back into open water. The fleet did not pursue, because it did not have to. The beast had already marked them, and the Stormborn was no longer just a ship. It was a piece of the game, and the game was only beginning. Chapter 7. The Prisoner's Tale. The Survivor Who Shouldn't Be. The Stormborn rode the dying winds of its escape, its sails tattered, its crew half dead from exhaustion and terror. The Shadow Fleet had vanished into the mist behind them, but the Whispers had not. Below deck, the wounded moaned in pain. Von Richten lay unconscious, his face pale, his blood laced with black veins. Yelena Volkova had not spoken since the escape, and her breath came too slow, too measured, as if she was listening to something beyond the ship, something no one else could hear. And in the ship's brig, shackled to the rusted iron bars, sat the man who should not have been alive. The prisoner, a man stolen from death. They had pulled him from the wreckage of a half-sunken war galley, a man so drenched in salt and death that many of the crew had refused to touch him, fearing he would crumble to dust in their hands. Yet here he was, a skeleton of a man, his skin pale and stretched thin over his bones, his eyes sunk deep into his skull, his lips cracked as if he had not spoken in centuries, and across his body, inked in charred black sigils, were symbols that shifted when no one was looking. Aldric Faust stood before the bars, arms crossed. The prisoner's mouth twitched, as if the word itself was a cruel joke. His voice came thin, rasping, distant, as if it had traveled through too many mouths before reaching his. "I had a name once." His gaze flickered up, and Aldric saw the depth of something wrong in those sunken eyes. But names are like waves. They erode, they shift, they become something else. Aldric's patience was thinner than his mercy. "Then tell me something useful before I throw you back to whatever hell you crawled from." The prisoner's cracked lips curled into something like a grin. "You seek to kill the beast." His voice was thick with something close to laughter, but there was no joy in it. "But it cannot die. It only becomes—" Aldric's fists clenched. "Then what does it want?" Huber Marsh. The prisoner exhaled slowly, leaning forward, his chains rattling. "Not what it wants, Captain." His grin widened, revealing too many teeth. "What he wants. The Isle of the Forsaken." The prisoner licked his lips, as if tasting the weight of the words before speaking them. "The doctor is an island," he murmured, "far beyond where sane men sail. It is not always there, not always real, but the tide knows it. It is called the Isle of the Forsaken." The name sent a ripple of unease through the room. Even the ship seemed to groan at the mention of it. Aldric said nothing, waiting. The prisoner's fingers twitched, tracing an unseen pattern against the floor. "The Isle is where the great game reaches its next move, and there—" He smiled again, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There waits the chosen." Yelena, silent until now, shifted from her place in the shadows. Her voice was hoarse. "Oh." The prisoner turned his head, and for the first time, his expression faltered. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. The sigils on his skin burned black, shifting as if something unseen turned their pages. Finally, the words forced their way from his throat. "The air in the brig seemed to tighten, as though the name itself had weight. Aldrich felt it pressing against his ribs. the same way one feels the first roll of a coming storm. Who is he? The prisoner's eyes glowed faintly, the sickly shimmer of a candle flickering inside a skull. A sorcerer of the architect. A weaver of fates. A man who has already died 1,000 times and will die 1,000 more before his work is done. His gaze darkened, his grin fading. He does not seek to kill the Chaos Beast, Captain. His voice dropped to a whisper. He seeks to bind it. The true horror. The words hung in the air, like the last breath before a ship sinks. Aldric's stomach turned. The thing they had fought, the nightmare in the water, the thief of faces, the beast that took Oscar Varn and left nothing but echoes. Someone wanted to chain it, to bring it into flesh, to wield it. He stepped closer to the bars, his voice steady but laced with cold fury. Inoy. The prisoner's lips parted, but his words were not his own. His mouth moved against his will, his body tensing as something else spoke through him. The tides shift, Captain. His pupils dilated into nothingness. His chains rattled, though no one touched them. The beast has no master, but all seek to claim it. His body arched violently, his voice rising to a rasping shriek. It will be bound in blood. It will be flesh. The next move is made. The ship lurched. The lanterns guttered. The prisoner's body convulsed, his skin peeling as the shifting sigils on his flesh burned white. 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 Then he went still. And his voice, 1,000 voices at once. "He already sees you, Captain." Then the man collapsed into dust. Silence. Aldric turned away from the empty chains, breathing hard. His hands trembled. The hunt had started as a pursuit of a monster. Now it was a race against something far worse. They had to find the Isle of the Forsaken, before Cervantes did. Chapter 8. Dreams of the Architect. The tides of sleep. The first dream came like a whisper on the tide. It crept through the ship in the dead of night, slipping into the minds of the crew like an unseen current, pulling them down, down, down into a place where time did not flow as it should. Aldric Faust did not remember falling asleep, only the sensation of something turning the pages of his mind, rifling through his thoughts like a thief in the dark. Then he was standing before the tower. It loomed impossibly high, its spire coiling like a serpent made of obsidian and bone. The stone shimmered between states, as though it could not decide whether it was solid, water, or light. And at the top, a single eye watched. Not a symbol, not a carving. An eye, huge, lidless, seething with the color of shifting stars. It knew him. Captain. The voice did not come from the eye. It came from everywhere. Aldric turned, and his own reflection stared back at him. But it was not a mirror. It was another him, and he was smiling. "You should have drowned, Aldric. You should have been the first." Aldric reached for his cutlass, but the other him raised a hand. "No." And suddenly, Aldrich saw them all. 1,000 versions of himself. Aldric with a beard white as bone, laughing atop a golden throne. Aldric standing in rags, whispering to shadows in the ruins of a burned ship. Aldric with no eyes, no mouth, his skin cracked like porcelain, his body twisted into something that still breathed. And then, Aldric standing beside Cervantes the Many-Eyed, his hand resting on the Chaos Beast's chained throat. The monster was not hunting him. He was leading it. Aldrich whispered, "This isn't real." His reflection laughed. "Isn't it?" The tower's eye blinked, and Aldric woke up. The crew's nightmare. The Stormborn was not the same. The moment Aldric stepped onto the deck, he felt it. A shift. A wrongness. The crew looked hollow, their eyes sunken, their movements slow and uncertain, as if they were not entirely awake. Some whispered as they worked, speaking words that made no sense, that did not fit their mouths. Others stood staring at the water, their gazes distant, as if something was calling to them beneath the waves. And then there was Yorick Onehand. He was scribbling on the deck with a stolen dagger, carving symbols into the wood with frantic, shaking hands. The same symbols that had burned into his skin. "Yorick!" Aldric called, stepping forward. The sailor's hand stopped mid-carve. He looked up, his face pale, eyes wide with a fear too deep for words. "Captain?" His voice was a whisper. "We all saw it, didn't we?" Aldrich's stomach turned to stone. "I saw what?" Yorick's fingers trembled as they traced the air, mimicking the shape of something too vast to describe. The tower. Silence. Aldric's pulse thundered in his ears. They had all seen it. The captain's changing reflection. That night, Aldrich stood alone in his cabin, staring at the mirror nailed to the wall. His hands shook as he reached for the blackened astrolabe, its surface shifting like liquid shadow. He turned it, watching the sigils align, waiting for it to point toward something real, something solid. Instead, the needle turned toward the mirror. Aldric froze. He slowly looked up, and his reflection did not move. It stood watching him, its eyes glinting with something almost amused. Then, with slow, deliberate purpose, it smiled. Aldric's breath caught in his throat. His reflection lifted its hand, moving before he could. And then it spoke. "You're already making the wrong choice, Captain." Aldric's fingers tightened around his cutlass. "What are you?" His reflection tilted its head. "The better question is, what will you become?" Then the glass shattered. And for a moment, in the broken shards, he saw 1,000 versions of himself, all watching, all waiting. And in some he was smiling back. Chapter 9. The Isle of the Forsaken. Land that should not be. The Stormborn cut through the mist, its hull groaning as if the ship itself feared what lay ahead. The Isle of the Forsaken loomed like a wound in the sea, its jagged cliffs rising black and sharp as a beast's ribs. The water around it did not lap against the shore. It recoiled, as though the ocean itself wanted nothing to do with this place. The land was wrong. The very air hummed with quiet whispers, 1,000 voices speaking just below the threshold of understanding. Shapes moved in the mist, crawling things with too many limbs, too many eyes. The trees, if they could be called that, twisted like figures frozen in agony, their bark pulsing as if breathing. Aldric Faust stood at the prow, his grip tight on the rail. Yelena Volkov, pale and quiet since their shared nightmares, whispered, "It shouldn't exist." Aldrich exhaled, his breath misting. And yet, here we are. As the Stormborn drifted toward the shore, the fog peeled away like rotting flesh. And they were waiting, the spawned and the broken. The beach was lined with figures that had once been men, chaos worshippers. Some were wrapped in ragged cloaks, their faces hidden behind twisted masks, sigils of Tzeentch branded into their flesh. Others had mutated beyond recognition, arms splitting into feathered tendrils, eyes blinking from their palms, mouths forming where no mouths should be. But they did not attack. They waited. One figure stepped forward, all cloaked in robes that shimmered in colors that had no name. His face was hidden beneath a mask of smooth obsidian, featureless save for 12 shifting eyes, each blinking in a separate rhythm. And then the mask split down the middle, parting like a mouth. Captain Faust. His voice was a thing of layers, speaking in many tones at once, overlapping, harmonizing, discordant. Aldric did not move. Cervantes. The sorcerer spread his 2 long fingers, gesturing to the island behind him. Welcome to the heart of the great game. A devil's bargain. The crew disembarked with weapons in hand, but they were not attacked. The warp congregation simply watched, silent and expectant, their bodies twitching and shifting in unnatural rhythms. Aldric stepped forward. "You know what we seek." Tzeentch inclined his head. "I do." The shifting eyes on his mask glowed faintly, studying Aldric, peeling him apart piece by piece. "You have seen its true nature now, haven't you?" His voice was almost mocking. "You know that this is no mere beast. It is an idea given form, a tide that can never be truly stopped." Aldric scowled. "And yet you think it can be bound?" Tzeentch chuckled, his mask twisting as if grinning beneath it. "Everything can be bound, Captain, even fate itself." He stepped closer, the air around him warping with every movement, as though reality had to adjust to his presence. "Join me, Faust. Help me bind the beast, and in return I will give you the power to shape your own fate." His voice dropped to a whisper that was not a whisper, an echo that seeped into the bones. "No more nightmares, no more losing your men to the tides, no more playing by his rules." Aldric felt the weight of the words, the promise that coiled like a serpent around his mind. The crew stirred uneasily behind him. Jorik Onehand, still haunted by the living text burned into his flesh, spoke first. "You can't be thinking of this, Captain." Another voice, Dorn, the quartermaster, a pragmatist, a man who had seen too much war. "If it can end this madness, it's worth considering." Then Yelena, stepping forward, her eyes hard as ice. "Tzeentch is a servant of the architect. He is just another move in the game." She turned to Aldric. "If we bind it, do we not just hand the chains to another monster?" Tzeentch sighed, amused. "So many doubts." He gestured behind him, and suddenly the mist cleared. Aldrich's breath caught. Atop the ridge beyond the beach, standing between ruins of impossible geometry, a figure loomed in the distance. It was not quite formed, its shape shifting, too many arms, too many mouths, its stolen voices whispering even now. The Chaos Beast. It had come for them. Tzeentch spread his arms. "You may refuse me, Captain. You may fight. You may die. But the tide does not stop." His voice was almost gentle now, almost pitying. "Or you may stand with me and we will forge the next move together." Aldric gritted his teeth. The crew looked to him. This was the moment. To take a demon's hand to kill a greater demon. Or to defy the architect's game and risk everything. Chapter 10. The Trial of the Changer. The door that wasn't there. The entrance had not been there before. Aldric Faust knew this. He had studied the cliffs, traced the jagged ruins with his eyes as Tzeentch led them up the winding path, past mutated cultists and whispering stone idols. And yet, now, at the summit of the Isle of the Forsaken, there stood a door, not carved into the rock, nor built by mortal hands. It floated, suspended in the air, its frame pulsing with shifting symbols, its surface reflecting the sky above, the sea below, and something else entirely. Tzeentch gestured toward it with a languid wave. "The trial of the changer awaits, Captain." The air shivered as he spoke. "The architect does not reward blind obedience. If you wish to stand before the beast, you must first prove that you understand what it is, and what you are." Aldric scowled. "And if we refuse?" Tzeentch chuckled. "Then you will never leave this island." Behind Aldric, the crew shifted uneasily. The island's very presence had begun to weigh on them. Time had begun to stretch. The air had turned thick, as if the world itself was tilting beneath them. Something was watching, waiting. Aldric exhaled. "Fine. But if this is some trick..." Tzeentch spread his many-fingered hands. "Then let it be a trick worth playing." Then he stepped aside, and the door opened. the ever-shifting labyrinth. Aldrich stepped through first, and the world broke. For a brief, unbearable moment, there was nothing. No sound, no sensation, just the feeling of falling through pages of unwritten history, a tide of possibilities crashing into each other. And then, he stood in a place that should not exist. The others were nowhere to be seen. The labyrinth stretched before him, its walls shifting between stone, bone, and living flesh. The pathways twisted as he looked at them, some leading upward into the sky, others spiraling downward into a sea that was not there. Footsteps echoed behind him. Aldrich turned and froze. He was looking at himself. Past sins and future lies. The other Aldrich stared back at him, older, scarred, clad in the regalia of a Lord Admiral of the Empire. His coat was lined with gold, his cutlass polished and pristine. He smirked. "You should have listened to me, Captain." Aldrich gripped his own weapon. "What are you?" The other him tilted his head. "What you could have been." He stepped forward, his boots not making a sound against the shifting floor. "Do you remember the day you turned down the Elector Count's offer?" Aldrich's jaw tightened. "That was a lifetime ago. A mistake." The Admiral's voice was colder now. "You could have had power, ships, command of the Imperial fleet. You could have hunted chaos across the old world instead of running from it." Aldrich's grip on his cutlass tightened. "And what did it cost you?" Before Aldrich could answer, the Admiral lunged. Their blades clashed in a storm of sparks, their footwork identical, their movements matched in perfect synchronicity. Aldrich struck first, slicing a shallow wound across the Admiral's arm, and pain exploded in his own flesh. Aldrich staggered, looking down to see the same wound forming on his own body. The Admiral smiled. "You cannot kill what is already within you." The labyrinth laughed. The others faced their trial. While Aldrich fought his own reflection, the crew wandered through their own nightmares. Jorek one hand stumbled through a field of dead men, their bodies marked with his own scars. They spoke in his voice, repeating every sin he had committed, every betrayal, every man he had left to die. Dorn the quartermaster walked into a great banquet hall where a feast was laid before him, only to see his own corpse at the head of the table, gnawing on his own bones. And Yelena Volkova stood before a vast, endless ocean, her reflection shimmering with 1,000 possible versions of herself. Each one whispered a choice. Serve the architect, and you will understand everything. Deny him, and you will be forgotten. You have already changed. You have already lost. Yelena clenched her fists. The moment she spoke the word, the ocean shattered. The breaking of the trial. Aldrich was losing. The Admiral was his equal in every way, each wound mirrored, each strike countered. There was no way to win. Unless... Aldrich dropped his blade. The Admiral hesitated, and Aldrich lunged barehanded, grabbing his counterpart by the collar and dragging him forward. The Admiral's eyes widened in surprise. Elric snarled. "Then let's see if you can kill me without killing yourself." The Admiral hesitated, and in that moment the labyrinth unraveled. The walls shattered into a storm of color and light, the floor twisting back into something real. And Aldrich was no longer alone. The crew stood beside him once more, some bleeding, some gasping, some changed in ways they did not understand. Savates stood at the exit, watching them with mild amusement. "Not bad," the sorcerer mused. "You are still yourselves, for now." Aldrich wiped blood from his lip, his heart still pounding. Savates smiled beneath his mask. "Now, Captain Faust, you are ready to meet the beast." Chapter 11. The Captain's Choice. The price of power. The air smelled wrong. Not of salt or rot or the damp breath of the sea, but something else. old parchment burning, ink boiling, the scent of knowledge turning to ash. Aldric Faust stood at the edge of a precipice that had not been there before. The Isle of the Forsaken had changed. Where once there had been ruins, now a great temple of shifting glass and bone rose against the sky, its spires twisting and curling in ways that defied geometry. The walls pulsed, not solid, not liquid, but something in between, like reality itself was uncertain whether it should be stone, fire, or thought. And above it all, watching, was the beast. It no longer lurked in the shadows. It no longer hid behind the veil of nightmares. It stood, wrapped in coils of whispering light, its many faces shifting in and out of focus. And one of those faces was his own. Aldric staggered back. The world tilted. The beast laughed. The future that could be. The laughter did not come from one voice, but many. 100 variations of himself, all laughing, all speaking in unison. Then the world split open. Aldric fell through time, through futures that had not yet been written, and pasts that had never truly ended. And suddenly, he was standing on the deck of a ship that was not the Stormborn. A ship made of obsidian and screaming faces, its sails stitched from the flesh of the fallen. His crew knelt before him, no longer human, their bodies twisted into perfect servants of change, each marked with gifts from the architect, each whispering his name in reverence. And there, at the heart of it all, stood himself. Not as Captain Aldric Faust, hunter of beasts, but as Aldric the ever-changing, champion of Tzeentch, the tide-born lord. His armor glowed with the color of shifting stars, his flesh inscribed with knowledge not meant for mortals. His left hand was a gauntlet of swirling flame, his right a book that wrote itself with every passing moment. And at his side, bound in chains of silver and paradox, the Chaos Beast knelt before him. Not wild, not untamed. His servant. Aldrich watched, frozen in horror, as his future self turned to him. Now you see, don't you? The champion smiled, stepping forward, his many eyes gleaming. You were never meant to destroy it, you were meant to become it. Aldrich tried to step back, but there was nowhere to go. Nowhere but forward. The revelation. The scene shifted again. Aldric was no longer on a ship. He was standing before a mirror. His own reflection stared back at him, but it was not him. Not yet. It was the Chaos Beast. But now he understood. The beast was not a creature. It was not some mindless thing of the void, crawling from the abyss to consume. It was an echo of his own will. A fragment of himself, torn from the pages of fate. It had been shaped by his choices, his fear, his anger, his need to hunt, his refusal to bend. Tzeentch had not sent it to torment him. He had created it. The architect was not forcing his hand. He was offering it. Aldric Faust, the reflection whispered, its many mouths forming his name. You have always been playing the game, but will you be the pawn or the player? Aldric stared into the abyss of his own making, and the abyss smiled back. The choice that was never a choice. Aldrich snapped back into reality. He was on the Isle of the Forsaken once more, standing at the threshold of the shifting temple. His crew was behind him, watching. Tzeentch the Many-Ed stood beside the entrance, waiting. The Chaos Beast loomed above, and Aldric knew. He knew that this was not a battle that could be won with swords, not a war that could be fought with cannons. This was a game that had already been played long before he had ever set sail. His own will had created this nightmare, and now he had one chance to rewrite the ending. Tzeentch smiled. You understand now, don't you, Captain? Aldrich exhaled. and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, he smiled back. Chapter 12. Betrayal at Dawn. The Chains of the Architect. The ritual began before the sun rose. Not that dawn had any meaning on the Isle of the Forsaken. Here, light was an afterthought, a sickly haze that crawled across the sky in unnatural patterns. Tzeentch the Many-Eyed stood atop a dais of black stone, his robes rippling as if caught in unseen currents. The runes beneath his feet bled colors that did not exist, shifting and twisting, rewriting themselves as the sorcerer spoke. "By the will of the great changer, I name you." His voice echoed through the ruins, reverberating against the air, the sea, the bones of reality itself. The Chaos Beast stood before him, coiled in the ruins of an impossible temple, its form shifting between nightmare and prophecy. It did not move. It did not fight. It watched, waiting. The sorcerer lifted his hands, fingers twisting into gestures that did not belong to mortal anatomy. Chains of liquid silver burst from the ground, wrapping around the beast's shifting form. The air screamed. The crew of the Stormborn watched in tense silence, their weapons drawn but useless. Yorick I clutched his chest, whispering prayers to Manan. Dorn, the quartermaster, spat into the dirt, muttering about sorcery and bad endings. Yelena stood motionless, her lips pressed into a thin, knowing line. And Aldric Faust, he watched it unfold with the weight of knowledge pressing against his ribs. This was not a victory. This was and the beast had already made its counterplay. The moment of reversal. Tzeentch laughed, his many eyes blazing with the glow of stolen futures. "You thought yourself beyond the weave, didn't you?" he whispered to the beast. "But even you are bound by the tides of fate." The silver chains tightened. The Chaos Beast shuddered, its form folding inward, its many mouths opening not in a scream, but a sigh. Then it smiled. Tzeentch hesitated, just for a fraction of a moment. But that was all the beast needed. It did not break the chains. It rewrote them. The sigils inverted. The silver binding shifted from prison to offering. And Tzeentch realized he was the one being bound. The collapse of reality. Tzeentch shrieked, his body twisting unnaturally, his arms elongating, his own magic turning against him. Oh no, but it was too late. The Isle of the Forsaken shuddered. The temple split apart, its spires unraveling into ribbons of molten time. The sky fractured, not with light, not with darkness, but with a void of infinite possibility. The ocean itself rose up, curling backward, flowing up the cliffs instead of crashing against them. Oh! The Stormborn lurched, its hull groaning as the sea beneath it stretched too far, too thin, bending toward an abyss that had never been there before. And then the isle began to sink, not into the sea, into something deeper, something beneath the fabric of reality itself. Aldrich had seen men drown before, but never an island. Back to the ship, a desperate flight. The crew ran. The cultists screamed as their forms twisted, their bodies unraveling into strands of probability, their bones turning into whispers. The Chaos Beast watched it all, and it was laughing. Eldritch and the survivors of the Stormborn raced across the crumbling stone, leaping over collapsing bridges, dodging falling debris that turned to ink the moment it touched the ground. Yorick fell behind. Aldrich spun to grab him, but Jorik's face was already shifting. His skin became words. His mouth became a scream that stretched into the wind. Then he was gone. The storm above devoured him. More crewmen vanished into the void, their forms flickering between past and present, their final words echoing in languages that had never existed. The ground beneath them gave way. Aldric leapt for the last remaining ledge, his fingers barely catching the edge of the Stormborn's hull. Yelena grabbed his arm, hauling him aboard as the ship reeled violently. And then the Isle of the Forsaken collapsed. Like a dream, forgotten the moment you wake. The aftermath. The Stormborn drifted. The ocean was quiet, too quiet. The island was gone. No wreckage, no ruins, no sign it had ever existed. Half the crew was dead. Von Richten lay barely breathing, his wounds festering, his lips moving in silent prayer. Yorick was gone. Dorn was gone. So many others were gone. And Aldrich, he stood at the helm, staring at the horizon, because he knew the truth now. They had not escaped. The game had simply moved to the next phase. And the Chaos Beast, it was still watching. Chapter 13. The Harbinger of Change. Voices in the fog. The sea was dead. Not calm, not still, dead. The Stormborn drifted through an ocean that did not move, its surface like polished glass, reflecting a sky that had no stars. The horizon was wrong, shifting, distant one moment, impossibly close the next. The crew was silent. Half of them were gone, swallowed by the collapse of the Isle of the Forsaken. Those who remained were not the same. Some muttered words in tongues they had never spoken before. Some had hands that trembled as if writing letters unseen. Some simply stared at nothing, eyes unfocused, as if waiting for something to speak through them. The fog rolled in. Not mist, not natural. It came like fingers curling over the deck, dragging the light away, filling the lungs with something thick, something not meant to be breathed. And from within it, they heard his voice. The captain that was not. Aldric Faust drew his cutlass on instinct. Because he knew what was coming. The fog coiled and thickened, and from it stepped the first figure. Himself. Not a trick of the light, not a reflection. Another him. Aldric in Imperial regalia, standing proud and cruel, his face aged with wisdom and arrogance, his hands stained with the ink of decrees and the blood of traitors. Then another. Aldric in golden chaos-forged plate, his body marked with the sigils of change, his eyes burning with the light of 100 futures. Then another. Aldric half-beast, half-man, his skin a canvas of shifting words, his breath carrying the whispers of the deep. And more, a dozen versions of himself, some warlords, some gods, some horrors, some nothing at all. And then they spoke together. Captain Aldric Faust. The words rippled through the crew, inside their skulls rather than in their ears. Von Richten, barely conscious, groaned in his sleep. Yelena staggered, her breath ragged, her fingers twitching as if fighting something unseen. Dorn, the only one still standing strong, spat on the deck. "Damon filth!" The Aldrich smiled in unison. "Is that what you believe?" Aldrich tightened his grip on his cutlass. "You wear my face like a mask, beast. That doesn't make you me." The Aldrich in golden chaos armor stepped forward, tilting his head. "No." He gestured, and behind him the fog parted, revealing the Isle of the Forsaken. It was whole, untouched, as if it had never collapsed, never fallen into the abyss. The crew gasped. Aldrich felt the weight of it sink into his gut. "Lies." The golden Aldrich smiled. "No lies, Captain." He raised a gauntleted hand, and the isle burned. Not destroyed by chaos, not erased by madness. It burned in golden light, purified by a fire that did not belong to mortals. And Aldrich saw himself standing on the ruins, a conqueror, a champion, a man who had embraced change and shaped it into his own design. "You already know the truth," the Golden Aldric said. "You were never meant to hunt the beast. You were meant to become it. The choice given." Aldric did not move. The crew watched him, waiting. Some looked hopeful, some looked afraid. Von Richten groaned again, his skin growing paler, his body rejecting whatever sickness had taken root in him. And then Yelena spoke. "This is how it wins." Aldric's gaze flicked to her. She was trembling, but she stood firm. "It doesn't kill you, it doesn't conquer you, it changes you." She turned, looking at the crew, her voice stronger now, despite the horror creeping into her eyes. "It's not giving him power, it's making him choose." Aldric swallowed. The Golden Aldric nodded approvingly. "She understands. That is why she is marked." Yelena flinched. "I am not." "You are." And for a moment, the crew saw her. A dozen versions of Yelena. A Yelena with a third eye, whispering the secrets of the void. A Yelena with silver chains binding her hands, a prisoner of her own knowledge. A Yelena standing beside Aldric the Chaos Champion, smiling as they rewrote the world together. She gasped, clutching her head, forcing the visions away. The Golden Aldric turned back to his original self. "Embrace change, Captain. It is the only constant. You have seen what awaits. You know what must be done." The air grew heavy. Reality itself seemed to hold its breath. The fog was not just mist anymore. It was a crossroad. Aldric Faust had been given a choice, and choices had power. The Golden Aldrich extended a hand. "Say the words, Captain." Aldric stared at it. He could feel the weight of fate pressing against his shoulders. The Stormborn had already drifted too far from the world of men. The line between hunter and hunted was gone, and somewhere deep inside him he knew this was not the first time he had been given this choice, and it would not be the last. The whispers swelled in his skull. The Golden Aldrich hand remained outstretched. The crew waited. The beast watched, and Aldric took a breath, and chose. Chapter 14. The Tempest of Madness. The ocean awakens. The first sign was the taste of the air. Not salt, not brine. Something thicker, something rancid, something that left a coating of wrongness on the tongue. The Stormborn cut through the black waters, its hull groaning, its sails pulling against winds that did not exist. The sea should have been calm, should have been silent. Instead, it whispered. Not the crash of waves, not the usual groan of shifting tides. Actual whispers? Voices beneath the surface, their murmurs rising, falling, singing in tones that did not belong to mortals. The crew stood frozen at their posts, staring at the water with wide, bloodshot eyes. And then the ocean blinked, the sentience of the deep. Aldric Faust saw it happen with his own eyes. The entire expanse of the sea shifted, no longer water, no longer fluid, but a mass of shifting orbs, pale, lidless, unblinking. Ice. Thousands of them. Blinking in unison, opening where waves should be, rolling in the currents. And then the mouths formed. Not like creatures breaching the surface. The ocean itself became mouths. Maws lined with needle teeth, yawning open in laughter that did not make sound, only feeling. A tide of gnashing hunger, of screaming void. The Stormborn lurched violently, the waves beneath it no longer water but something else entirely. The crew reeled, some clutching their heads, others dropping to their knees, whispering prayers that were drowned out by the sea itself. And then Von Richten screamed. Von Richten's fall. The Inquisitor had been dying for days. His wound had festered, his skin gone pale, the veins beneath it blackened like spilled ink. But it was his mind that had broken first. He had not spoken for hours, Not since the encounter with the Golden Aldric, not since the whispers had started calling his name. Now he stood at the edge of the deck, his eyes wild, unfocused, lost in some horror no one else could see. "Do you hear them?" His voice was raw, cracked, desperate. Aldrich stepped forward. "Von Richten, we have always been here," the Inquisitor shrieked. "The sea was never just water. We were blind! We were blind!" He clawed at his own face, his nails raking across his already sunken skin, his breathing ragged, broken. And then he started laughing. Not in madness. In understanding. "The game was never for us, Captain." He turned, grinning wide enough to split his lips. "We are pieces, not players." Aldrich moved to grab him, but the crew was already moving. Hands grabbed von Richten, dragged him to the rail. He did not resist. He smiled. "I see it now." The ocean reached for him, and the crew threw him overboard. Aldrich lunged, too late. Von Richten's body hit the surface, and the sea swallowed him. Not drowned, not consumed. The moment he touched the shifting mouths, the infinite eyes, his body unraveled. Not into blood, not into bone, into letters, sentences, script ripped from parchment that had never been written. His very existence was torn into whispers, into echoes, into words. And then he was gone. The sea shuddered. The sky screamed. And the ocean rose. The maelstrom of fate. The Stormborn lurched violently, the waves no longer water, but a spiral of thought, of voices, of shifting possibilities. The sky bent inward, the stars pulling into themselves, stretching too far, too thin. The storm was not lightning and wind. It was a vortex of unmade choices, a maelstrom of unwritten fates. Aldrich roared orders, his voice barely cutting through the howling madness. "Hold fast, tie the lines, stay together." But the ship itself was betraying them. The masts bent at impossible angles, the sails torn by unseen claws. Crewmen were dragged into the vortex, not by wind, not by water, but by possibilities. One moment they were there, the next they had never existed. Aldrich staggered back, gripping the wheel with all his strength, his knuckles white as the world came undone around him. And then, the Chaos Beast spoke again. Not in words, not in sound, but in certainty. The storm became its voice. The sea became its will. The game had reached its final stage. And Aldric Faust, he was no longer sure if he had ever been the one playing. The Stormborn was no longer sailing. It was falling, plunging into a sea that had never been water. And the last thing Aldrich heard before the world went black was his own voice, whispering from the depths. "You never had a choice, Captain." Chapter 15. The Reflection Below. A sea that was never a sea. The Stormborn did not hit water. It did not crash into waves or shatter against jagged rocks. It fell through something deeper. The moment the ship plunged into the vortex, the world around them fractured. The sky tore apart like parchment burned from the edges inward. The stars bent and stretched, and the ocean ceased to be a thing of salt and tide. This was not water. This was thought given liquid form, an abyss of whispers and unmade futures. An ocean of shifting timelines, and in its depths, something looked back. The impossible horizon. Aldrich Faust gasped for breath, clawing at the ship's wheel, trying to find something solid in a world where solidity was a lie. The Stormborn drifted through a sea of liquid time, its sails catching winds that had not yet blown, its hull creaking under the weight of histories that had never happened. The water, if it could be called that, was not still. It moved in ripples of color and darkness, stretching outward in all directions. and on its surface, reflections that were not reflections. The crew gathered at the rails, staring, then staggering back in horror, because the things looking back at them from the shifting depths were not their reflections. They were versions of themselves, lost futures, dead possibilities, the echoes of what they could become, and some were already too far gone, the damned and the doomed. The first to see himself was Dorn, the quartermaster. The man had always been a hard soul, sharp-edged and pragmatic, loyal to the coin first, the crew second. But now he saw himself below the waterline, staring up at him with eyes black as voids, his body wrapped in barbed chains that pulsed like veins. "I made the deal, Captain." The reflection's voice rippled up through the liquid abyss. "I traded loyalty for certainty. It was easier this way." Dorn stumbled back, muttering prayers to Sigmar. Then Yorick one hand. Except it wasn't him. Not anymore. His reflection was something else entirely, his body elongated, his skin flayed away, revealing flesh made of shifting script. A man who had not just become the book, but the words themselves. The sea was always a page, Captain. The reflection grinned, its teeth etched with scripture. "And now I am written in its story." Yorick screamed. He turned, vomiting over the side, but the bile was not bile, it was ink. And then Aldric saw himself, the captain of the endless fleet. Aldrich's hands went cold as he looked down, because there, watching him from the depths, was another Aldric Faust, one that had already chosen. The chaos-marked Aldric stood tall, clad in obsidian armor etched with the ever-changing sigils of Tzeentch. His eyes glowed with endless knowledge, his lips curled into a knowing smirk. Behind him, an impossible fleet stretched across the abyss, sails of flesh and shadow, ships bound together in a flotilla of nightmares. The Lost Armada. And Aldric was its master. "You already know how this ends, Captain." Aldrich gritted his teeth. "You're not me." The other Aldrich laughed. The words rippled through the sea, twisting reality as they sank into Aldric's mind. "Look at yourself. Look at what you've done, what you've lost. You think you are still a man? You are already part of the great game, Aldric. You were never hunting the beast. You were chasing your own reflection." Aldrich shook his head, stepping back from the rail. No, this wasn't real. This wasn't, but it was. The Stormborn groaned, its wood shifting, its sails catching impossible winds. They were sinking, not into water, but into themselves. And the Stormborn was no longer a ship. It was a story that had already been written. The ink was still wet, and Aldric was holding the pen, the choice that must be made. The golden Chaos Aldric stepped forward, raising a gloved hand. "Join me. Stop fighting what you were always meant to become." The abyss began to rise, the Lost Armada reaching for the Stormborn, the weight of fate pressing down like a closing book. The crew screamed, some falling to their knees, others clawing at their own reflections, trying to erase what they saw. Yelena gripped Aldric's arm. Her fingernails dug into his skin, her breath ragged. "Captain?" Aldric tore his gaze from the abyss, from himself. He looked at his crew, the ones who were still alive, the ones who had not yet been rewritten. And in that moment, he knew the sea would take them if he let it. But maybe the sea did not have to write the final chapter. Maybe that was his choice to make. Aldric drew his cutlass, and he made his choice. Chapter 16. The Architect's Last Move. The Illusion of Choice. Aldric Faust stood at the helm of a ship that was no longer a ship, sailing a sea that was no longer a sea. The Stormborn drifted through the abyss, the shattered reflections of his crew staring back at them from the liquid tapestry of fate. Time no longer held its shape. Past, present, and possibility bled together like ink spilled across parchment. And in the swirling black above them, woven into the churning sky of a realm that was not real, the pieces moved. Tzeentch was watching, not with eyes. It did not need eyes. Not with hands. It did not need hands. The great architect did not sit upon a throne, did not whisper from a mortal mouth. Its will was the storm, the tide, the shifting lines of history that rewrote themselves with every breath. And Aldric had been playing a game he never understood. Until now. The hand that moves the board. The golden armored version of himself still stood in the abyss, watching, waiting, a figure of infinite potential. The reflection had not moved, had not faded, because it did not need to. You are still fighting. The words came from everywhere, not just the reflection. From the waves, from the sky, from the bones of the ship itself. Aldrich tightened his grip on the wheel. And what would you have me do? Bow? A ripple of laughter, not mocking, not cruel. Amused? You already have, Captain. Aldrich ground his teeth. No. I chose to resist. I chose to hunt the beast. The air shifted, colors bleeding through it, sounds forming in echoes that had not yet been spoken. And yet here you are. The golden-armored Aldrich stepped forward, the weight of his many futures pressing down on the deck. You call it the beast, but it has always been you. Aldrich felt something unravel inside his skull. The pieces were no longer scattered. They aligned. The hunt for the beast, the shifting nature of its form, the way it whispered his own voice back at him, the thing he had been chasing through the tides, was his own fate, and Tzeentch had known it from the beginning, because Tzeentch had written the game. Aldrich was not the hunter. He was the prize, a game already won. The storm twisted above them, folding into itself, forming shapes that did not hold their shape. For a brief moment, Aldrich saw everything. He saw himself on 100 different ships, on 1,000 different seas, in 1,000,000 different worlds. Some where he never set sail, some where he took the deal, some where he became the thing that whispered in his own ears, and not one where he truly escaped. There was no way out of the maze, because Aldrich was the maze. You were always going to reach this place, Captain. The golden Aldrich raised a hand, gesturing toward the shifting reality around them. You have struggled, fought, resisted, but every step, every desperate clawing for freedom, was another move in the great game. He smiled. And now the board is set. Your last move is at hand. Aldrich's breath came slow, steady. He felt the weight of every moment pressing against his chest. He could see the choice that lay before him. He could embrace the fate laid out for him. Step forward, accept his place in the architect's web. Become the next piece in the game. He could do something else, something the game had not accounted for, because there was one thing even Tzeentch could not fully predict. One thing it could never control. Chaos. Real chaos. Not the careful, deliberate weaving of futures, but madness, the defiance of the game itself. Aldrich's knuckles turned white around the wheel. He turned back to his crew, those who remained, those who had survived this nightmare alongside him. Yelena, Dorn, the remnants of the Stormborn's battered men. They had been reduced to nothing but fragments in the architect's game, but they were still standing. Aldrich exhaled, and he made his final move. You've made a mistake, Tzeentch. The storm paused. The golden Aldrich tilted his head. Have I? Aldrich smirked. You gave me the chance to make a choice." Then he tore the wheel of the Stormborn hard to port. The ship groaned, its reality-bent hull twisting, breaking away from the inevitability laid out before it. The sea screamed. The sky shattered. The realm of chaos roared in protest. And Aldric Faust, the man who was never meant to escape, did exactly that. The Stormborn vanished into the storm, and for the first time in an eternity, the architect's game had to adjust. Chapter 17. The Captain's Gamble. The game breaks. The Stormborn should have been lost. No ship had ever left the realm of chaos. No mortal had ever stood before the shifting tides of Tzeentch's will and lived to tell of it. The sea was not water, not space, not time. It was a prison with no walls, a labyrinth with no exit. And yet, Aldric Faust held the wheel, and the ship still sailed. The golden-armored version of himself still stood on the deck of the Unreal, watching with unreadable curiosity. His expression was neither amused nor disappointed, just expectant. "You think you can outrun fate, Captain?" Aldric's teeth gritted. His knuckles were white against the wheel, his veins burning as if fire itself flowed through them. "I don't have to outrun it." He turned the wheel harder, the ship groaning, splintering, but obeying. And the Chaos Beast screamed. Not a sound of rage, not a sound of hunger, a sound of pain, forcing reality to kneel. The beast was not used to pain. It was not a creature that could bleed. It was change itself, a force of unmaking, a tide that swallowed all it touched. And yet, as Aldric fought against the very currents of chaos, something shattered in its vast, many-faced form. The Stormborn was supposed to sink. The crew was supposed to become part of the tide. Aldric was supposed to be absorbed into the game. But he had done something the architect had not planned for. He had not chosen. He had refused. The realm of chaos began to shift. Not under Tzeentch's will, under his. Aldric felt the weight of his own existence pressing outward, a force of defiance that tore through the illusions around him. The beast's form rippled violently, its many stolen voices breaking, clashing, overlapping like a symphony being ripped apart. "This was never your game to win, Captain." The golden Aldric's voice was calm, unwavering, but for the first time, he did not look certain. Aldric grinned. "That's where you're wrong. The wound that should not be." He let go of the wheel. For a moment, just a moment, the ship floated weightless, caught between the forces that wanted to pull it apart. Then, Aldrich stepped forward, onto the deck. The golden Aldric watched him, unmoving. The beast, still writhing in pain, tried to reform, to twist into new shapes, to adjust. But Aldric would not let it. For the first time he saw the truth. The Chaos Beast had never been unkillable. It had only ever been a reflection. Aldrich raised his hand, and he willed the thing to die. Not with a blade, not with cannon fire, with sheer, unyielding will. Reality shuddered. The Chaos Beast screamed again, its many mouths twisting, its stolen faces contorting, its many-formed body rupturing. The room echoed with a shrieking cry, all running to depression-worthy odium, exultation nearing, adrenaline flooding. A wound opened in its form, a gaping chasm of nothingness, something it had never experienced before, something it did not know how to change. Pain. The storm around them writhed, as if the entire realm of chaos had felt the wound. Aldrich stepped closer, his boots steady against a deck that should not exist. "You were never meant to be caged." His voice was calm now, steady, unwavering. "And neither was I." The Chaos Beast shrank away, not in fear, not in rage, in confusion. It had never been wounded before. It had never lost. And now it was losing. The great game fractures. The golden Aldric watched. And then he laughed. Not in amusement. In understanding. You were never the prey. Aldric locked eyes with him. No. The golden Aldric tilted his head. And now? Aldric smirked. Now? I make my own damn game. The Stormborn lurched forward, tearing through the collapsing storm, breaking free from the beast's dying screams. The golden Aldric raised a hand in parting. And then, the realm of chaos shattered. Aldric felt himself ripped forward, through light, through shadow, through every possible version of himself that had ever existed. And then there was only sky, only wind, only a real ocean beneath him. And the Stormborn sailed into the dawn. Chapter 18. The Beast's Death or Rebirth. The Final Gambit. The Stormborn burst from the impossible sky, crashing back into a world of tangible reality. The ship groaned as it hit true water, the waves churning beneath it, the wind howling through its tattered sails. The crew, battered and broken, staggered to their feet, gasping, trembling, alive. But the fight was not over. The Chaos Beast had followed them. The moment reality restored itself, the sky split once more, and from the gaping wound, the beast tumbled through. It was injured, wounded in a way that should not have been possible. Its form flickered violently, its many faces losing cohesion, its voices screaming in discord. But it was not dead, and if it could not consume this world, it would unmake it. The ocean swelled beneath it, the waves forming into grotesque spirals of flesh, eyes, and raw possibility. The wind twisted, reversing upon itself, the sky folding and refolding in endless shapes. The world was breaking, and Aldric Faust had only one move left. A paradox of change. Yelena Volkova staggered forward, blood dripping from her nose, her eyes flickering with the remnants of the storm. She saw it first. The astrolabe, the blackened, twisted artifact that Schwarzschild had given them in Sartosa. It had been just a tool, a device meant to track the beast. But now it was something more. Aldric had willed the beast to be wounded. That meant it could be trapped. Yelena snatched the astrolabe from where it had fallen on the deck, her fingers trembling as she traced the shifting runes. Captain Aldric already knew. He grabbed the astrolabe, its weight twisting in his hands, the surface no longer metal, no longer solid, just raw motion, raw flux. It was a vessel of change, a prison built for something that was never meant to be caged. The beast saw it, and for the first time, it screamed in fear. The binding of the unbound. The sky shattered, 100,000 realities bleeding into one as the beast lashed out. The crew cried out as gravity itself rebelled, as the ocean churned into raw nightmare, as time snapped apart. But Aldric stood firm. "This ends now." He slammed the astrolabe onto the deck, its runes igniting with impossible fire. The Chaos Beast lurched, its vast shifting form suddenly dragged toward it, as if caught in a current far stronger than itself. The paradox had begun. The astrolabe was change given form. The beast was change given hunger. And in this moment, they became the same. The beast's many faces flickered, twisting through 100 versions of itself, struggling, fighting. But it could not escape its own nature. Aldric pushed forward, his will clashing against the thing that had haunted him, that had stolen his men, that had whispered his own voice back at him. He saw every choice that had ever led him here, every path he could have taken, every version of himself that had already fallen. And he rejected them all. The astrolabe snapped shut. The world exploded into silence. The aftermath. The sky cleared. The ocean was only water again, and the Chaos Beast was gone. Aldric swayed, his breath heavy, his fingers still locked around the astrolabe. It no longer pulsed, no longer whispered. It was quiet. The beast had not died. It had been sealed, trapped in a prison of endless contradiction, an eternal loop of transformation, caught between forms forever, neither alive nor dead, neither past nor future, just change, bound within change. Yelena, still gasping, still shaking, gripped his shoulder. It's over. Aldric stared at the horizon. The sea was still. The crew was alive. And for the first time in what felt like eternity, Aldric Faust was free. Chapter 19. Escape from the impossible. The sea that was not the same. The storm-born drifted in silence. The sky was clear now, the storm gone, the Chaos Beast sealed within the astrolabe. But nothing felt right. Aldric Faust stood at the helm, gripping the wheel, his breath heavy, his pulse slow. The sea stretched outward in every direction, but it was not the same ocean they had left. The stars were too distant, as if they belonged to another sky entirely. The waves did not lap the hull as they once had. Instead, the water seemed to breathe. And the crew, the Stormborn, was not as full as it had been. Not because of death, because of absence. Some men were simply gone. Not dead, tossed overboard. They had simply never been. Their names did not linger. Their absence was not felt. It was as if they had never existed at all. And that was somehow worse. The crew that was left. Dorn, the quartermaster, stared at his own hands, his calloused fingers now lined with faint, glowing script. He exhaled, pressing them against the wood of the ship, where the symbols bled from his skin into the grain, twisting into shapes no man should ever carve. He ripped his hands away, breathing heavily, his face pale. "Captain," he muttered, "what did we do?" Aldric said nothing. He turned to Yelena. She was staring at the water, her face unreadable. "Do you feel it?" she whispered. Aldric frowned. "Feel what?" She didn't answer. She only raised her hand, and the wind obeyed. Not a spell, not sorcery. The wind bent toward her palm, as if it were no longer something separate from her. She closed her fist. The wind stopped. She opened it again. The wind returned. Aldric's stomach turned cold. "You've changed." Yelena nodded. Her voice was quiet. "We all have. The ghosts that were never there. More things were wrong. They found a room below deck that should not have existed. Inside was a journal written in Aldric's own hand. But he had never written it. The pages detailed events that had not happened, choices he had never made. They found a hammock where no man had ever slept, a sword in the armory that belonged to no one, a single boot in the cargo hold, too large for any of the surviving crew. And worst of all, they found their own names written in places they did not remember, etched into the mast, carved into the galley table, scratched into the inside of the hull, as if someone had written them long ago. Aldric ran his fingers over his own name, carved into the captain's quarters. The grooves felt old, older than he was. Escape, but to where? The compass no longer pointed north. The maps no longer made sense. The Stormborn sailed for days, but the world refused to take shape. The ocean did not stretch in a way that obeyed reason. The coastline never appeared, no matter how far they traveled. Time bled together. Some men slept for hours and awoke in the same moment they had closed their eyes. Others swore that they had lived through days, while no time had passed at all. And then, They saw the first ship, not a ship they recognized, not a ship that should exist. It was their own. A second Stormborn, sailing on the horizon, drifting in the same direction, its sails torn in the same places, its deck splintered in the same way. And standing at the helm, Aldric Faust, watching them, waiting. Aldric's hands turned to ice. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady his mind, trying to force his body to obey him. But deep inside he knew they had escaped the storm, but they had not escaped the game. Chapter 20. The Price of Knowing. The harbor that wasn't home. Marienburg loomed through the mist, its towering spires and sagging docks unchanged, untouched by the horrors Aldric and his crew had endured. And yet it felt different. The Stormborn slid into the harbor with a quiet reluctance, as if the ship itself knew it no longer belonged here. The dockhands barely spared them a glance, no celebration, no Imperial agents waiting, no sign that anyone in the city had known they had been gone at all. Aldric stood at the helm, staring at a world that had not changed, while he had. His fingers twitched against the wheel. His own reflection shifted in the polished brass compass mounted beside him. Not a trick of light, not exhaustion. It moved on its own. For the first time, Aldric wondered if the Stormborn had ever truly returned, or if it had simply drifted into another version of itself. A name that no longer fit. The crew disembarked in silence. Dorn stepped onto the dock and flinched, rubbing his temples. His shadow did not match the shape of his body. Yelena paused at the gangplank, gripping the railing as if the wood was alive beneath her fingers. They walked through the streets of Marienburg like ghosts haunting their own pasts. The city was loud, crowded, alive. Aldric could smell fish, burnt tallow, old wood, cheap rum, the sounds of merchants haggling, of whores calling from tavern balconies, of sailors laughing and cursing in a dozen tongues. It was all the same, and yet no one said his name. No recognition. No, Captain Faust, you've returned? It was as if they had never left, as if they had never existed. The letter arrived that night. He was waiting for him in his quarters at the Black Gull, the same tavern where this nightmare had begun. The envelope was plain, no wax seal, no mark of sender. Just his own name. Aldric stared at it for a long time. He did not want to open it, because he already knew. His hands shook as he unfolded the parchment, the ink staring back at him in a script identical to his own. Captain Faust, you have reached the next step. There is no victory in the great game. There is only movement. You tried to break free, you tried to win. You cannot win, Aldrich, you can only play. You will receive this letter again. You will write it. And one day you will send it. And the cycle will continue until you accept what you are, until you become what you were always meant to be. Until you make the final move. Welcome to the next phase, Captain. Aldric Faust. His own signature was scrawled at the bottom. His own writing. His own words. Aldric sat back, feeling the weight of inevitability crush his ribs. He reached for his glass of rum and caught his reflection in the window. He was smiling, but he wasn't. The final revelation. The Chaos Beast had never truly been defeated, because Aldric Faust was now part of it. Not as its prey, not as its hunter, as its next piece. The great game was not over. It had only just begun.